Welcome to Understanding Your Church with Systems Thinking, Part 2. I'm John Messer, and today we're going to continue to learn about systems thinking applied to your church. So let's hop in. We're going from an overview of systems thinking in everyday life. So today, in Lesson 2, we're going to talk about linear quick fix thinking and systems thinking, and then we're going to compare the two. Linear thinking is our go-to mode of thinking. It's what we've been taught to do from our earliest age. Linear thinking is the result of kind of a enlightenment perspective. It's a scientific perspective. It's very good. Systems thinking, on the other hand, is a framework, a body of knowledge, and the tools to see the full patterns. It's a way of seeing wholes rather than parts and processes rather than static snapshots. And that's good because we tend to pick things apart. Our scientific linear approach is we'll break things down into the smallest parts and then we'll understand the whole. Systems thinking takes the opposite approach. We'll understand the whole and therefore we'll understand the parts. So let's talk a little more about linear thinking. It's called open loop thinking also because it's essentially a straight line from problem to fix. Linear thinking, because it tends to see a problem and then a solution to the problem, and only the problem and a potential solution, it tends to apply that fix without any consideration of how that fix, how that solution will actually impact the problem and other things. So it's a straight line from problem to fix, and it doesn't necessarily solve the problem because every action, every decision has consequences. And linear thinking doesn't think about consequences of applying the fix. How will that impact the problem? How will that impact the other parts of a system? Because it tends to see the problem and apply a fix and just say, okay, done, we applied the fix, it's called quick fix thinking. It tends to treat problems, symptoms of problems rather than the problems themselves. Linear thinking is much more focused on symptoms than it is on the underlying problem. Why? Because the symptoms are the things that cry out for some sort of action. Underlying problems are more hidden. They're not obvious to everyone. The symptoms are the events or the crises that people experience that they're looking for instant solutions, for quick fixes. So linear thinking tends to be more focused on symptomatic pain than on dealing with underlying problems. The difference between linear thinking and systems thinking is the thing called feedback. So there's a problem and we're going to apply a fix. Systems thinking then says, okay, well, if we do that, how will that impact the problem? What will that do to the problem? Will it actually accomplish what we intend? Or will there be unintended consequences? How will that affect all the rest of the system? Because every change we make has consequences, and those consequences are not always what we intend. And it's the unintended consequences that often make the problem worse. And that's why when we apply quick fixes, we often end up having to solve the same problem again and again and again because we never really resolve it. We're just treating the symptoms of the problem. And sometimes if we keep applying quick fixes, we will actually make the problem worse rather than doing anything to make it better. So feedback is the big difference between linear thinking and systems thinking. Linear thinking tends to ignore it, but systems thinking anticipates it. It looks for it. It expects it because every change changes everything in systems language. So every change that we make, every policy we adopt, every action has consequences, both intended and unintended, and those consequences are feedback. And there's always feedback. It's whether we see it or recognize it or not. Here's a great example that I just came across recently. Experts are warning about the unintended consequences of CDC mask guidance. That was in the news in May of 2021. And what they're recognizing, what they're saying in this article is that the Centers for Disease Control didn't anticipate the consequences of their decision regarding mask guidance. Excellent illustration of the fact that systems thinking is necessary and linear thinking happens even in the government. So it's important to know that thinking about systems in linear ways is really unproductive. It's very unproductive. Why? Well, because this is attributed to Einstein. Whether he said it or not, I don't know, but we can't solve problems with the same thinking that created them. And that's exactly right. If linear thinking created the problem, we're going to need to think differently in order to solve that problem. And systems thinking works because it sees beneath the surface. It recognizes more than the symptoms. It looks for the underlying problem. So it's important to know that thinking about systems in linear ways is really unproductive. It's very unproductive. Why? Well, because this is attributed to Einstein. Whether he said it or not, I don't know, but we can't solve problems with the same thinking that created them. And that's exactly right. If linear thinking created the problem, we're going to need to think differently in order to solve that problem. And systems thinking works because it sees beneath the surface. It recognizes more than the symptoms. It looks for the. So, as I said, linear thinking tends to treat symptoms, and they tend to recur because they don't solve the underlying problem. And so church leaders end up playing whack-a-mole, dealing with the same problem over and over and over again. And very often in a church, you'll find that you feel like you're putting out forest fires, or you'll find that the problems get worse and you can't understand why that's happening. So repeatedly treating the same symptoms will exhaust a church leader, and it gets the churches stuck. So what are the differences between linear and systems thinkers? Well, linear thinkers break things into their component pieces. That's that scientific approach. We'll break it down into smaller and smaller parts, and then we'll understand the whole. They tend to be concerned with content, and they try to fix problems, or excuse me, they try to fix symptoms. They try to control chaos to create order, because they think that social systems are predictable and orderly. Systems thinkers are more concerned with the whole, and they're concerned with processes over content. They look at underlying dynamics, not just the symptoms, and there's the great value when it comes to churches. And they don't try to control chaos, they look for patterns in the midst of it. And rather than thinking that they're predictable and orderly, they believe that organizations are unpredictable in a chaotic environment. And so that unpredictability is important for us to understand as systems thinkers. So why do we use systems thinking? Well, primarily because if we don't understand that things are interrelated, the solutions that we try to apply often create more problems. And that's very often unintended, and it's a result of feedback. Systems thinking is valuable because the simple questions are very often ones that require a little more thought. They require some reflective thinking. We tend to think in cause and effect, meaning problem, solution, fixed, done. Things tend not to work that way, especially in social systems. It tends to be a little more complicated, and just good to train ourselves to think with feedback in mind. Also, leadership by design is better than by default. One is reactionary, one is proactive, and reactionary leadership is very difficult to make forward progress. You're constantly being controlled by circumstances and events. And as I said, we can't solve problems with the same kind of thinking that created them. And so if linear thinking created the problem, we need to apply systems thinking to resolve the problem. It's very much like Heifetz and Linsky described in their adaptive leadership material. It's getting ourselves off of the dance floor where we're focused on the parts, we're involved, and we have a very linear perspective of things, to get up into the balcony so we can see the whole big picture, all of the interactions of the parts. And that's really what it's about, is seeing the interactions. It's not just seeing the parts, but it's seeing how they interact. They're all interdependent, all interrelated, and that's where all of the consequences and the feedback come from when we make a decision and take an action. So one of the questions I would ask you is, was there a time when you took a balcony perspective on an issue? And what difference did that perspective make in your approach to the issue? Did it help? Did it give you insights that enabled you to solve a problem more readily? Systems thinking sees the forest and the trees, not just one or the other. It sees both. It sees the dance floor and the balcony. It sees the system and it sees the parts, but it focuses on the interaction between the parts. So, to summarize, we have to realize that interdependent social systems are different than linear thinking would suppose, because every action affects every part of the system. That's feedback. And those unintended and intended consequences are what we are focused on when we're talking about feedback. And systems thinking anticipates and looks for that feedback. So if we want to be healthy, good leaders in a social system, we need to take the systems approach to leadership.